Peace. I'm Brian Musser. I'm the Baptist campus minister at Drexel University, and this is a sermon that I will be sharing Sunday, May 1st at Grace Bible Chapel. This will be kind of the YouTube version of it. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Brian Musser. I'm the Baptist campus minister at Drexel, and it has been my privilege to work alongside churches, especially in the Philly area, but sometimes extending outside of that network and helping them see the mission field outside of their church doors. So often in Christian community, we invite others to come in and experience the Christian community within the church, but how do we empower ourselves to actively be Christians, engaging our neighbors with what we believe in a way that is normal for both us and them? So this sermon is entitled Witnessing to a Weary and Worn Out World, and it's taken from Matthew 9:35 through 38. Just to read that passage to begin with, we have the text here. And then Jesus went to all the towns and villages, teaching in the synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he felt compassion for them, because they were weary and worn out, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is abundant, but the workers are few. Therefore pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest." And we're going to look at this passage, and it's a very simple passage. It's a rather short passage, and there's four main ideas I want to draw out of this passage. But before I get into that, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I do and how I go about ministry on a university campus. Several years ago at Drexel, I was part of something called the Spirit Committee. You might think this had something to do with my job as a campus minister, as a pastor, but not really. The Spirit Committee's primary goal was to promote school spirit among the student-led professional staff. We attended basketball games, played softball together, learned the school fight song, and a bunch of other silly things just to encourage ourselves to feel pride in the institution. I volunteered on the committee. It was not a requirement for me. I remember one of the other committee members being impressed with how committed I was to the events that we would try to promote and put on. But being part of that committee was one of the ways I chose to be present in the Drexel community, in my community. I formed relationships with the other committee members, and through those relationships, I was able to share the gospel with some of them. Another time, I went to help a Christian student organization, Cru, you might know them, or Campus Crusade for Christ, on my campus, pass out cupcakes like 11 o'clock on a Friday night, kind of up around the fraternity and sorority row. One of the students commented that they knew it was me when they saw me coming from a long way off, from a distance, because I was the only gray-haired person that would be on campus that late at night. Sometimes just showing up and being involved in the community is enough to get the door opened for the gospel. What part of your community are you intentionally investing in for the sake of the gospel? Now, when we look at this, the very first words of this, Jesus went to all the towns and villages. Show up. We need to intentionally be present in the lives of others and in our community for the sake of the gospel. The short passage we are examining starts with, Jesus went to all the towns and villages. Jesus showed up. First and foremost, Jesus showed up in the incarnation. God didn't send us a how to be saved owner's manual. He didn't write us an email. He didn't create a TikTok or a Facebook message or a clever meme. He showed up. He didn't invite us to the temple or give us a Google map with directions to heaven. He didn't make an instructional YouTube video. All these things are good, and I do most of them. But they are not what Jesus did. Jesus showed up. Jesus not only showed up in flesh on earth, but while he was on earth, he traveled a lot so that he could connect with folks. I mean, uh, the King James Version starts the story of the Samaritan woman with this phrase that's always stuck with me. He must needs go through Samaria. In order to meet the Samaritan woman, he had to go to that well and be there when she was there. Jesus showed up, and we can use that as an example for ourselves. This might be an unchristian thing to say, but this is where the combined church have an advantage over Jesus. When he was here on earth doing ministry, he had to spend time traveling to different towns. We are already there. Last night at the Mission Weekend kickoff event, we did a fascinating activity which illustrated how many touchpoints Grace Bible Church already has in the local community. You are already there. For you to go to all the towns and villages around here, you wouldn't have to do anything different than what you already are doing. Jesus had to intentionally leave heaven and come to earth. Then once here, he had to travel from place to place to be present. You are already there. But are you intentionally leveraging your presence in the community for the sake of the gospel? Now, let me be honest here. I am an introvert. That might surprise you on some levels, but I am. And it's hard for me to do what is called direct evangelism. Direct evangelism is walking up to a stranger and starting a conversation implicitly intended to share the gospel. And because of my introversion and actually lack of social skills, when I do direct evangelism, it often comes off as rather creepy. This is complicated by the fact that I am getting older and I minister to a college campus. Imagine the awkwardness of socially awkward me approaching an 18-year-old female freshman from another country on a sidewalk of campus intending to talk about Jesus. That is not an effective evangelism strategy for me. I can do it. God can use it. But it does not fit who God has made me to be, and it does not fit the place God has put me in. And it isn't using my spiritual gifts to the best of my ability. Now, this is why I join committees and show up to events. I do so much better talking to people within a shared context. When we are doing something together, I can create a conversation out of that so much easier than when I'm talking to someone I just met. So the first thing is show up, get out there in the community, start going to things, and look for the relationships you can build within those pieces. Be present with your neighbors. Now, the second piece is see the need. Our neighbors are struggling. As this passage says, they're weary and worn out. They're struggling with relationships, lifestyle, purpose, belonging, and beliefs. I like those 5 categories. When Jesus showed up to these towns, he found crowds of people who were weary and worn out. It was an interesting how the different translations chose to phrase the Greek words behind weary and worn out in the Holman translation. There is quite a variety of different words used, but always the similar idea. And this is just based on a quick comparison on Bible Gateway. You can find all these different words and phrases used to translate those terms, weary and worn out. Abandoned, aimless, bewildered, cast away, confused, could not help themselves, dejected, discouraged, dispersed, dispirited, distressed, downcast, faint, harassed, harried, helpless, hurting, lying like sheep that have no shepherd, miserable, scattered abroad, thrown forth, tossed aside, travailed, treated badly, troubled, walking around everywhere, weak, weary, worn out, worried, and their problems were so great, and they didn't know what to do or where to go for help. Does that list sound familiar? Do you know people today in your neighborhood, at your work, maybe parents of your kids' friends that would fit that description. Maybe you're one of them. Now, I recently had the privilege to write a small group study for the churches of the Baptist Resource Network of Pennsylvania, South Jersey, about the questions folks are asking and how to connect those questions with the gospel. My mind likes organization and categories, and I have organized most of the questions I get asked into 5 categories. These categories are not some well-developed statements about the way the world works, but practical handles that help me navigate conversations. The 5 categories are relationships, lifestyle, purpose, belonging, and beliefs. When students ask me questions about relating to their parents who do not quite see them as an adult yet, it is a relationship question. These questions are like, who should I love? Who's going to love me? How should I treat everyone else? Then there are lifestyle questions. It's questions about the good life. What type of life should I try to have? How should I live? What does a balanced life look like? Is a good life even attainable? Then there are purpose questions. We only have so much time, energy, resources. What is truly worth my effort? That is actually at the heart of most purpose questions. Belonging or home is another set of questions. Where do I fit in? Where do I belong? Am I ever going to find a place that accepts me for who I am? Should I hide some parts about myself so that I can get along with others? And the last category is beliefs. This is probably the category that I've seen the most drastic cultural shift in my 17 years on campus. The most important belief question is no longer what is true, but who do I trust? We no longer have to find the truth. We now have to figure out which one is the truth. Curiosity was once the most important truth-seeking characteristic. The most important truth-seeking characteristic now is discernment. When I'm having a conversation with somebody in the back of my head, I am listening to them and they're shifting comments through these 5 categories, sifting their comments through these 5 categories. The weary and worn out, or harassed and helpless, or distressed and dispersed, or troubled and travailed, are struggling with relationships, lifestyle, purpose, belonging, and or usually and beliefs. They are like a sheep without a shepherd. Okay, and you can see these categories here again, just to remind you of what we're looking at. Our neighbors are weary and worn out, struggling in 5 key categories: relationships, lifestyle, purpose, belonging, beliefs. And when we find weary and worn out people, we want to connect the gospel with them. Jesus had compassion on the weary and worn out crowds. As he was traveling to all the towns and villages, Jesus was teaching, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing their diseases and sicknesses. Jesus' message brought them hope. His actions brought them relief. Do you believe the message of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection can make a difference in the lives of the weary and worn out around you? Now, the first question is, do you know the gospel? How well do you know it? Many Christians know the gospel when they hear it. They listen to the preacher share the gospel and they are able to recognize it. They are able to sit in a congregation on a Sunday morning and shake their heads. Yes, that is the gospel. That is what I believe. But what if the preacher left something out of the gospel? What if he added something to it? Would you be able to recognize something added or something left out of the gospel? That's a different level of knowing. That's a different level of learning. Would you be able to repeat the gospel after hearing it? Or would you be able to recite and remember the gospel from hearing it a long time ago? Have you worked through the gospel in an orderly way and maybe memorized a presentation of it? That's another level of learning. Would you be able to share the gospel in your own words? Would you be able to use a new or interesting metaphor to communicate the gospel in a normal conversation? How well do you know the gospel? And I challenge you that as we're looking to communicate the gospel into our community, knowing the gospel on the level where we're able to use our own words to communicate it in a way that is applicable to that very conversation is important. That's a level of knowing the gospel that many Christians don't get to, that aren't challenged to. I watch on my campus us training engineers to know engineering in a way that buildings don't fall down, or doctors to know the human body in a way that they don't always need to rely on, textbooks. We train people on to an expert level. Do you know the gospel on that level where you are able to say it at a moment's notice in your own words in a way that is connected to the conversation? So know the gospel. But the second question is, has the gospel changed your life? Now, I know we are in a church, and the answer to that question is always supposed to be yes, especially in a church. But seriously, what difference has the gospel made in your life? Tell me something specific. Tell me a story about your life, a normal situation in your everyday life that is better because of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Tell me something that has some realness to it, not just some vague Christian cliches or platitudes. Tell me a story about your life and how your life was better in this specific moment, in this specific place, because of the gospel. Let me give you an example. I was dating this girl my senior year in college, but then I went away for a while. Well, you know what they say about absence makes the heart grow fonder. She actually got fond of my absence and broke up with me. I was wrecked. I was hurt. I was angry. Now, a couple months later, she wanted to get back together and start dating again. I realized that whether or not we got back together, I still needed to forgive. And I remember talking to God about this. I remember saying stuff like, but she doesn't deserve it. And right at that moment, God, in a very godlike voice, said, duh, forgiveness is never deserved. All my time thinking about Jesus' forgiveness helped me to be able to understand that I could choose to forgive, or I could choose not to. It was my choice. It wasn't that she earned it or that she deserved it. It was on me to choose to forgive her. Then I remember asking, but what if she hurts me again? God replied, forgiveness always leaves us vulnerable. It was hard, but I chose to forgive. And learning to forgive with God as my example has been life-changing in my relationships. My belief in the forgiveness that is available through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus has given me a template to forgive and ask for forgiveness in my everyday relationships. This story about this relationship where I had to learn how to forgive came in handy when a student president of the Muslim Student Association asked for my advice on how to ask for forgiveness from his fellow student leaders because of mistakes that he had made. Now, he was my friend, so we already had the relationship, but there was a relationship question in his life about forgiveness that matched up with a story I have about how the gospel has changed how I do relationships. That telling him that story helped us get into a 2-hour conversation about forgiveness within Islam and Christianity, how they are similar, how they are different. I was able to share the gospel with him several times. One, because he had a question about relationships, and two, I had a personal story about how the gospel has affected the way I go about relationships. Do you have stories like this? How has the gospel changed your life on a practical level? This is where those 5 categories come in handy. Those around us are asking questions about relationships, lifestyle, purpose, belonging, and beliefs. Has the gospel changed how you relate to people? Do you have a good story about that? Has the gospel changed how you define the good life? Do you spend your time and energy in different ways because of the gospel? Can you tell a story about when you were tired but still did something important because of how the gospel has changed your life and your heart? Now, I am an extremely uncoordinated as a kid, and I'm still uncoordinated now. I blame my mom. She let me eat dirt. This one time when I was about 13 years old, I fell off of, I call it a cliff, but it was a short cliff. Landed headfirst into rocks. I was falling long enough to have 3 separate thoughts. The first one was the absolute certainty that I was dead. I was going to die. There was no way I was coming out of this alive. In case you were wondering, I was wrong. I didn't die. Just to clear that up. But right on the heels of that thought came this sense of peace. I was going to die. But that's okay. I knew that even if I died, I was saved and would end up in heaven with Jesus. That sense of peace has been a refuge for me throughout my life. I can remember how that felt, and I draw into that at times. It changed how I engaged the world. Now, the third thought was my neighbor, who was with me, is going to get in so much trouble trying to explain this. But that sense of peace, knowing that I was safe even if I was going to die, knowing that God is ultimately in control of my eternal faith, gave me a feeling of belonging in this world that has never left me. I am okay even at the worst of times. Ultimately, I am protected by God, even when I am not in a safe circumstances in the world. The world is God's world, so I am at home in His universe. This is the story that I sometimes tell when I'm having a conversation with somebody about their sense of belonging, their sense of home, their sense of place in this world. Now, the final category is beliefs. What do you believe to be true? How do we know what is true? Which one of these truth statements is right? Is anything believable? Does anyone tell the truth anymore? Who can I trust? When I share my story about how I first made a commitment to follow Jesus as a young boy, I'll now include the people who I trusted that helped me make that decision. Actually, Doug's dad, my mom, some of the children's worship leaders. I trusted them, and they have proven my trust to be true with lifelong commitments to following Jesus. I trusted them. And because of my trust in them, I also trusted Jesus. And because of my trust in Jesus, I have now proven Jesus to be faithful for 40 years because He has been faithful. And my trust has been well rewarded over these last 40 years. Now, the greatest Christian apologetic on my campus over these last 17 years has been the integrity of the students who are part of the Christian groups. Other students decide to follow Jesus when they see Christian students actually living in a trustworthy, worthwhile Christian life. So, with this question of beliefs, who do I trust? being trustworthy is a hugely important apologetic. Now, it's not just about living a good, godly life, though. We must talk about it and explain our actions. Let me illustrate this with a story from one of my Christian faculty group members. He talks about two different professors at an institution where he previously taught. One Christian professor would sit in his office during lunch break and read the Bible, thinking that this might be a good way to show that he lived his life differently. The other would be in his office with the door locked in an intimate relationship with one of his research assistants. Interestingly enough, both of those actions were treated by the other faculty members with almost the same attitude. That's not how I would live my life, but to each his own. Now, we desperately need to live our lives in a different way. We need to be Christ-like examples in the world. But we also need to use words to explain the meaning behind our choices. Without an explanation, our life choices just look like eccentricities that have no relevance to the life of others. That's just how I chose to live my life. To each his own. But the idea is, I have found meaning that you are looking for as I have chosen to live my life this way. If we can explain our choice to follow Jesus, helps us relate to others well, live a good life, gives us a sense of purpose and a sense of belonging, and gives us access to someone who is always true and trustworthy, then our worn out and weary world would listen to that. Especially if we are trustworthy people ourselves and we can explain it in a personal story. So I challenge you, take some time, examine your life, see if the gospel has changed you. Now there's a danger here. What if you can't identify how the gospel has impacted your sense of purpose or one of the other categories up here? Then I would suggest you found the perfect place in your life to work on your discipleship process. Ask one of the pastors here, how could the gospel change my sense of purpose? How could it bring meaning to how I spend my energy and my effort? If you can't find a story, maybe that story's in the future. Maybe that story's about to happen in your life. The last thing in this passage and the last thing we need to do with this is pray. Pray for your neighbors. Pray for God to give you opportunity to share your stories. Pray for others to join you. Jesus tells his disciples to pray to the Father for more workers. Look at this room. And remembering how many were here last night and looking forward to how many will be here in the second service. It is my firm belief that there are enough people in this room right here, right now. There are enough people associated with Grace Bible Church to change Rising Sun, Bayview, Zion, Calvert, or Clora, Conowingo, whatever town you're a part of, there are enough people to change it. We saw last night how intimately connected the members of Grace Bible Chapel already are in this community. If all of us were to actively engage this weary and worn out world with the practical application of the gospel to their point of need, this community would change. Pray for workers. Ask God to help you connect with your neighbors in meaningful ways. Ask God to bring to mind stories about your life that can communicate to others how the gospel has changed you. Pray to the Father that your friends sitting here in church with you will join you on this journey. In a world that is weary and worn out, we have the good news that can change their lives. We just need some folks to intentionally show up for the sake of the gospel and the kingdom. Amen.